August 1942. Deep in the South Pacific. On an island cloaked in emerald jungle and ringed by turquoise water, a shadow was spreading. This was Guadalcanal, a name few in the outside world had ever heard. But on its northern coast, Japanese engineers were carving a runway out of the wilderness, a dagger aimed at the heart of Allied supply lines to Australia. For the United States, reeling from Pearl Harbor and a string of defeats, this was a threat that could not be ignored. The decision was made. America would strike back. But this wasn't a calculated, well-supplied counterattack. It was a desperate gamble. The U.S. Marines sent to seize that airfield were about to be thrown into a living nightmare, a 6-month crucible of fire, disease, and primal fear. They were told it would be a quick fight. They were wrong. This is the story of how a place nobody wanted became the place nobody could afford to lose, the brutal, bloody turning point of the Pacific War. On the morning of August 7, 1942, the U.S. 1st Marine Division stormed ashore. Operation Watchtower was underway. The initial landing was surprisingly easy. The Japanese construction crews, caught completely off guard, melted into the jungle, leaving behind their equipment and half-eaten bowls of rice. Within a day, the Marines had seized their primary objective, the nearly completed airfield. They promptly renamed it Henderson Field, in honor of a Marine aviator killed at the Battle of Midway. It felt like a victory, a swift and decisive blow. But the jungle was watching, and the sense of ease was a fleeting illusion. The real battle for Guadalcanal had not even begun. Just 2 days later, the war came roaring back. In the dead of night, a Japanese naval force slipped undetected into the waters around the island, a strait that would soon be known as Iron Beadham Sound. In a devastating naval engagement, the Battle of Savo Island, they sank for Allied heavy cruisers and killed over 1,000 sailors. The American fleet, shocked and crippled, was forced to withdraw. This left the 11,000 Marines on Guadalcanal utterly stranded. Their supply ships, only partially unloaded, were gone. They were left with limited ammunition, meager rations, and the crushing sense of isolation. They were now the hunted, surrounded by a dense, hostile jungle on one side and a Japanese-controlled sea on the other. The Japanese Imperial Army, convinced the American force was small and weak, launched their first counterattack. Colonel Kiyonao Ichiki, a veteran of the fighting in China, landed with a force of about 900 elite soldiers. Brimming with overconfidence, he believed he could sweep the Marines off the island in a single night. On August 21st, his men charged headlong into the Marine defenses along a sandbar at the mouth of the Ilu River, which the Marines called Alligator Creek. It was a massacre. The Marines, dug in with machine guns and artillery, held their ground and annihilated the attackers. The Battle of the Tenaru, as it became known, was a brutal lesson for both sides. For the Japanese, it was a shocking underestimation of their enemy. For the Marines, it was a grim taste of the ferocity and fanaticism they would face. As days turned into weeks, life on Guadalcanal became a singular, grueling struggle for survival. The jungle itself was an enemy. Torrential rains turned the ground into a sea of mud. Malaria, dysentery, and fungal infections, which the Marines grimly called jungle rot, ravaged the ranks, proving just as deadly as Japanese bullets. Food was scarce. The Marines subsisted on captured Japanese rice and whatever meager supplies could be flown in by the newly operational planes from Henderson Field. At night, the psychological warfare began. Japanese patrols would infiltrate the perimeter, whispering and calling out in English to draw fire and reveal Marine positions. Enemy bombers, nicknamed Washing Machine Charlie, would fly over nightly, not to inflict major damage, but to deny the exhausted Marines a moment's sleep. By September, the Japanese understood the true scale of the fight. They landed a much larger force under Major General Kyote Kawaguchi. His target was a grassy ridge that overlooked Henderson Field from the south. Seizing this high ground would allow Japanese artillery to pound the airfield into dust. On the night of September 12th, Kawaguchi's forces launched a series of ferocious assaults on the Marines, defending the ridge. The fighting was desperate, often hand-to-hand in the pitch-black darkness. One Marine unit, led by Lieutenant Colonel Merritt Red Mike Edson, bore the brunt of the attack. For 2 straight nights, Edson's Raiders and the 1st Parachute Battalion held the line against overwhelming odds, throwing back wave after wave of attackers. When the sun rose on the final day, the slopes of the ridge were littered with the fallen. The Marines had held the ridge would forever be known as Edson's Ridge, or, more grimly, Bloody Ridge. Henderson Field was the heart of the campaign. The small beleaguered group of pilots and planes that operated from it became known as the Cactus Air Force, named after the island's codename, Every day, they flew patched-up fighters and bombers, battling superior Japanese aircraft and overwhelming odds to protect the Marines on the ground in attack. Japanese ships. Men like Captain Joe Foss and Major John L. Smith became legends, racking up incredible numbers of aerial victories. These pilots were the Marines' lifeline, their only shield against the daily bombing raids and the naval bombardments. The fight for Henderson Field was the fight for Guadalcanal itself. If the field fell, the island would fall. The naval war for control of the waters around Guadalcanal was just as savage. A series of brutal, chaotic sea battles took place as both sides tried to reinforce and resupply their troops. The Tokyo Express was the nickname the Marines gave to the nightly runs of fast Japanese destroyers that ferried troops and supplies down the slot, the channel leading to the island. In October and November, the naval conflict reached its peak. The Battle of Cape Esperance and the Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands were punishing affairs. Then, in mid-November, came the decisive naval battle of Guadalcanal. It was a sprawling three-day slugfest involving battleships, cruisers, and destroyers fighting at point-blank range in the dark. The U.S. Navy paid a heavy price, losing 2 admirals and many ships, but they succeeded. They turned back a major Japanese reinforcement convoy, dooming the Japanese army on the island. Iron Bottom Sound had claimed its final victims, and the tide had irrevocably turned. By December, the Japanese forces on Guadalcanal were starving. Their supply lines were severed, and they were trapped in the jungle, cut off and abandoned by their high command. The once proud soldiers of the Imperial Army were reduced to gaunt skeletons, suffering from malnutrition and disease. The hunter had become the hunted. The U.S. Army's 25th Infantry and American divisions arrived to relieve the exhausted 1st Marine Division, launching a final offensive to clear the island. The fighting was still tough, against an enemy who would rather die than surrender, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. Realizing the cause was lost, the Japanese High Command made a bitter decision. They would evacuate their remaining troops. In early February 1943, under the cover of darkness, stealth destroyers executed a brilliant and stealthy withdrawal, rescuing nearly 11,000 emaciated survivors. On February 9th, American commanders declared Guadalcanal secure. The 6-month nightmare was over. The cost was staggering. Over 7,000 Americans were killed in action on land, at sea, and in the air. For the Japanese, the losses were catastrophic. Over 24,000 dead from combat, disease, and starvation. But the significance of the campaign went far beyond the numbers. Guadalcanal was the definitive end of Japanese expansion in the Pacific. It was the first major Allied land victory against Japan, a brutal attritional fight that bled the Japanese military of veteran pilots, experienced sailors, and irreplaceable equipment. It proved that the American fighting man could beat the supposedly invincible Japanese soldier. It was a psychological turning point, shifting the momentum of the war. From the muddy hell of Guadalcanal, the long, bloody road to Tokyo began. The island that no one had heard of had become a name etched forever in the annals of war, a symbol of sacrifice and the turning of the tide. Thank you for watching. If you found this piece of history compelling, please consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel for more stories from the past. We'll see you next time.